your stuff?
Yeah. Okay, hi everyone. I'm Peter Dudson. I'm part of the WEXD project. I'm a postdoc on the project. And it's my pleasure to introduce Rainer Grundemann, who's talking about the rightful place of expertise. And then later we're going to talk from Christian Kost.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being back. I participated in a previous event. Some of you will have seen me there maybe on expertise and the disagreement on climate change. So today I'm talking about the rightful place of expertise, which of course is an allusion to Dan Zarewitz's book and others who have published with the title of The Rightful Place of Science.
It's an allusion to Obama's first inaugural.
Yes, but I had in mind science and the juxtaposition to science because I think expertise must not be confused with science. So there is a place for having a similar title that talks about expertise. So what I'm going to do is to introduce some conceptual distinctions. We heard a lot of distinctions already from philosophers. I'm a sociologist by training, so these will be slightly different. I think we need to unpack the notion of expertise. It's always or often treated as a sort of black box, and we all know what it means. And in order to do that, I will look at a social and the historical context of expertise. So socially, I think we need to look at this in the context of decision making. We heard before the coffee break there is the distinction between, having an opinion on something and the separate issue, what if we want to act on it. So I think expertise is always most usefully understood as a decision-making tool. And we should sociologically distinguish between different areas or level where expertise comes to be used. So there is, of course, politics, so you have scientific advice and other expert advice in political decision-making. You have it in organizations with consultancy, most famously, and citizens, of course, need advice in many situations in their life. We came across the potential tension between experts having authority and knowing better and thereby excluding so-called lay people. So this tension will be a big part of what I have to say. Now, there are different types of expertise that I distinguish here between so-called routine and professional expertise, and then situations where we have uncertainty and it's not clear what advantage a specialist technical knowledge would provide. So researchers, professionals, specialists are three terms that I will be explaining and showing that these are terms that have overlap with the notion of expertise, but are also mutually exclusive at times. And then historically, there is, of course, this long tradition of being critical about experts. And we had the more recent attack, the so-called populist backlash. And the question is the motivation for the criticism similar, or is it different? So this draws on work I've been doing before. So there's this book with Nicholls called Experts. And last year I published a paper called Climate Change as a Wicked Social Problem. So this slide tries to summarize and really bring together the two different areas of interest I have. So in terms of definitions, in that book we argued that experts mediate between knowledge production and application. They don't have to be knowledge producers. So this means it's not only scientists or researchers or academics or academic public intellectuals that could be experts. The important sociological argument is that experts are always in a relation to a client, to someone who wants advice, who wants expertise, and therefore they are judged by the client. This is different to arguments about, peer review, scientific peer review. It's a different social relation. Now, experts are typically asked to say, what should I do? Because there is uncertainty, and there may be experts who advise different things. And the question then is, what should you do? Experts clearly define and frame problems in that process. So depending on how they do that, they might come up with a completely different problem definition, therefore different solutions that they will promote. So the guidance for action is the important thing here. Now, expertise in which situations and for what, this is where I distinguish between so-called tame and wicked problems. You may not know this. This is a public policy paper from the 1970s, I think, Nicholls and Weber, saying that this was a paper about urban policy, saying people try to solve problems, social problems, as if they were technical problems. So if you talk about urban problems, all sorts of things, crime, drug taking, urban planning, these problems don't have a unique solution. You can't define these solutions technically. There will be endless political and technical debate about them. So if you think about tame problems, so these are problems where you have a unique solution. We could use drinking water, for example, which is, at least at the moment, a tame problem. You can define what it means to have clear, healthy drinking water, which complies to several standards, and that's a technical solution where you don't have a political debate around it. So technocracy is the term which has been used, the expert culture that can deal with these problems all the time. But when it comes to wicked problems, we see that this is not so easy, or it's impossible. And there is a strategy, maybe conscious or unconscious, by technical experts, especially scientists, to conceive of such problems as tame problems. So I've used the example of climate change in that paper, and that's the take of many climate scientists to pretend that this is a problem that has a unique solution, and thereby closing off public debate about what should we be doing. Okay, now definitions, you might say these are just semantic things, and I would agree there is no truth to be expected. It should only be helpful for the understanding, useful in a pragmatic sense. And I think we should really, this is what I would be arguing as a sociologist, trying to understand the role of skills and knowledge. This is something you can have embodied as an expert, as a professional, as a scientist. Different social actors who have that, and their relations among themselves in decision making between the expert and the client. So what constellation can you identify, and what differences will be interesting to analyze in as a result of that? So I start with what I think is a confusion sometimes if you don't distinguish carefully enough between different types of experts, looking at specialists, professionals, and scientists. So specialists, I think this is the nature of complex modern societies. We have a division of labor, and no one is a specialist on more than a few things. But we are all interdependent. So this is something, Durkheim and others more than 100 years came up with. This is partly influenced by Spencer and Darwin differentiation, functional differentiation. The question is, how does society hang together after we've become so differentiated that we know very little about the bigger picture? Now, we have overlap of specializations, but people tend to be confined to what they have learned, what they are good at. So there is this poses a problem. If this is too narrow, we can't expect that people will have. So this goes back to the previous talk before the coffee break. Are people, so-called experts or specialists, overreaching when they make pronouncements because they say, look at me, I have a university degree or I have a Nobel Prize, and therefore you should trust me. So I think specialists, defined as people who have a skill, embodied skills and knowledge, would still be able to work in the dark and not be experts in my definition, because nobody asks them for decisions under uncertainty. They do their work they are trained for. They work in bureaucracies, they work in companies, and they apply the rules, they develop the rules, and they try to do that job as good as they can. So routine operations and specialists have not a relation to a client. They don't provide advice in that sense. So I would say the difference here, if there is such an additional feature like dealing with uncertainty and giving advice, I would say yes, we are now looking at cases of expertise. There is no inherent essentialist criterion, to come back to the philosopher's question. I think this is just a sociological observation. If someone's expertise is requested, that person is an expert, right? We don't make any judgment about the quality or the inherent properties of the expertise that is offered. So the client-expert relation is the crucial one. Now let's look at professionals. So these are specialists that are certified. They, not all specialists are certified. Very old professions we know of, and these are usually the examples that the literature and expertise will focus upon: lawyers, doctors, engineers, very old examples, but not all expertise is professionalized. In addition, we have this phenomenon that we get more and more highly educated people who have university degrees or higher education of some sort, are able to read graphs, tables, statistics. Now, of course, with electronic media, there is lots of information people can tap into and therefore provide advice to other people, to politics. So they are more educated and therefore they have been called lay experts. Of course, that's an oxymoron. If you use the dichotomy between expert and amateur or lay person, that doesn't seem to go well together. I would say it's field expertise, but that's a minor point. Now let's look at science. So it follows from the definition that experts have to be in a social relation with the client, that scientists who do their work are not experts as such, unless they are asked to provide their expertise. So some scientists are professionals because their profession is certified and they have to train their students to become members of that professional association. So I think it's psychology in the UK is an example, but not sociology. Scientists are judged by their academic peers, mainly. That's where you get your reputation from, not by clients. So you have to do an additional step as a scientist who wants to provide expertise. The scientist needs to enter into a relation with someone who wants their knowledge for practical purposes. That would be an instance of experts, scientists being experts. So this means if we distinguish it in that way, there is a clear definition of how these terms hang together and what the important thing is for the topic of expertise, the function and their social roles. Now this is in the recent paper I published in Minerva. I won't go into great detail, but just to show you, if you look at the supply side of expertise, just the left-hand column, and the demand side. So the supply side has the scientific experts, professional experts, and so-called field experts. I didn't use specialists because they were defined as working in the dark and being not in such social relations, right? So scientific experts, if they are experts, they would be on government advisory committees, for example, right? Now professional experts, and this is where a different dynamic seems to set in, and you have different kinds of people there. So you have lawyers and engineers, you have scientific training, but they usually have a higher degree of expertise because that's what their job entails. So they feel sometimes obliged to say something about a specific situation and therefore provide expertise. So there is a higher probability that such people will be asked to pronounce on difficult decisions. Now, doctors and lawyers are also, of course, here if you are a private citizen and you want to get advice on what you should do with your ill health. But as the previous example showed, today most people are not happy with just trusting the doctor. So they enlighten themselves, they go to the GP and say what they want, right? And it's not as easily dismissed as it used to be when the doctor said, you've been reading that in the yellow press, right? If you come up with studies and say this is what I want, doctors are more likely to listen. Now anyway, so this is, I can't go into that in detail, but it shows you these are different social situations and social relations if you distinguish further in terms of who provides the expertise and in which context is it requested and applied. So NGOs, of course, think of environmental or health groups, are an important area of activity there. Business is relatively well studied through business school literature, I think, and it's, of course, mainly consultancy work. Now, let's go back in history. So this is the historical dimension. Alexis de Tocqueville, Frenchman traveling to America, 1835. The Frenchman observes, if I seek among those characteristics of the American habits, the principal one, which includes almost all the rest, I discover that in most operations of the mind, each American appeals only to the individual effort of his own understanding. So there is the striking observation for a Frenchman that there is this sort of individual autonomy, epistemic autonomy, whatever you want to call it, and you should give credence to that. You should respect that kind of attitude. Now, if this was taken out of context, and many people tend to do that, say, you know, this is what happens nowadays, and Tocqueville already observed it, this is a sort of denigrating of expertise or telling uneducated people that they have a right to opinion too, and it might be even counted as expertise. I would be careful doing that, because I think it's no coincidence that de Tocqueville observed that as a Frenchman being in the United States. So I think we would need comparative studies about political cultures. So the degree of deference to experts, I assume, is different. So de Tocqueville would have been influenced by the rationalistic political culture of France. So Max Weber's praise of bureaucracy, I think, is no coincidence that it happened in the German context, where you had a legal system that would try to identify all possible situations in abstract, which is completely different to common law, right? So there is this kind of, you could perhaps say this, he's theorizing what he saw in Germany, and therefore a deference to people who work in the bureaucracy because they are the specialists. So Sheila Jassanov made some interesting observations under the label of civic epistemologies, which is in fact comparing different political cultures and how they mobilize and bring to bear knowledge in decision contexts. And this is different in different countries, different political cultures. So I think if we were to follow that up, there needs to be a comparative perspective if you want to find out anything meaningful. Now, Habermas in the 70s wrote about 3 different models of expertise and decision making, where he distinguished between technocracy, decisionism, and pragmatism. So decisionism is not what philosophers and other people today understand. This is taken from Carl Schmitt's meaning of the word, which is politicians just decide. You cannot rationally argue about values. So they will ultimately take a decision which is not grounded in moral justification discourses, because it cannot be done. You have to choose your God and your devil, or whatever the quote there is. And this is what Habermas thinks is going on in contemporary society. The technocratic mode of decision making would be when the politician is a mere agent of the scientific intelligentsia, as it was called in the translation there. And so he didn't think this was an accurate description. Of course, what he wanted to see is what he called pragmatist model, which is an interplay between experts and the public, and other people have taken that up under the banner of deliberative democracy. So again, the empowerment of people was the important aspect here, and this is what probably many social scientists and left-wing liberals have developed as a political project. Now, slightly before Habermas wrote that, there is a book, very interesting read, by Theodore Rorschach, published in '68, developing ideas of Herbert Marcuse, for example, making reference to other people like Mumford, Jacques Ellul, and so on. And he uses the term technocracy as an elite of decision makers and technical experts that run the country. So the quote there, the experts who count are the certified experts, and the certified experts belong to headquarters. This is a key word. This was in the '68 rebellion. The students were talking about the headquarters. So these were corporate headquarters, but also, of course, party headquarters, governments, and so on. So he has a very candid description of all the motivations and also the flaws of that student movement, but he basically subscribes to the criticism. So there are a few quotes here which show you how technocracy works. So the amateurist citizen can't grasp the thing. So this goes back to the point I made about the division of labor. So technically, especially trained experts are there to believe in. The key institutions are think tanks. Again, this is a very American thing. Europe has them now increasingly, but this was taken for granted in the '60s. So think tanks, before the public has become fully aware of new developments, the technocracy has doped them out. Has nothing to do with dope, I looked it up. It's an Americanism apparently, meaning figuring it out. They have figured it out and laid its plans for adopting or rejecting, promoting or disparaging. And then this one, it's characteristic of the technocracy to render itself ideologically invisible. Its assumptions about reality and its values become as unobtrusively pervasive as the air we breathe. So there is, the picture here is one of a society that is governed to such an extent by technical experts that there is no realization anymore, that this is based on decisions, on values, on things that matter. It's like a machine that is well-oiled and the specialists just do that. So it's a completely different description of what we see today. There was no mentioning of uncertainty. There always seemed to be a right answer. It was just that the experts working away in the dark were doing that. Now, this counterculture impulse, momentum, carried over into many parts of society, of course also into social sciences and science and technology studies. So Silvio Funtowitz and Jerry Rabitz had this notion of postnormal science in the early 90s, saying that experts are laypersons when uncertainty is observed, because they are no better in deciding, because their technical specialism doesn't allow them to make better judgments. So uncertainty is the key thing here. We got lay expertise, the famous study by Brian Wynn, of course, sheep farmers, or the study by Epstein and others on patient groups in the development of AIDS treatment. So you get the involvement of lay people in these examples, and that's sort of indicative of a social and cultural change where you have empowerment of lay people. And the criticism was that the experts, of course, patronize the public, and that's a bad thing. We need more democracy. Now we have more democracy, only people voting for the wrong things from our perspective, right? So many left liberal social scientists are very uncomfortable with that situation and are thinking, probably as we speak and the months before, isn't there something wrong with our understanding of expertise? Shouldn't we praise expertise to prevent the masses from entering the field here? So I think this is where people like Michael Gove come in, and the American president. It's interesting what Gove said. So he's usually quoted as being, we had enough of experts, but he said we have enough of experts from organizations with acronyms saying that they know what is best and getting it constantly wrong. So he tried to use that, the discreditation of financial experts after the financial crash, to say, look what these people have done. Of course, it's now taken for granted that he was anti-expert. I would interpret it like with Trump, post-truth politics, alternative facts, and so on, that they are not against experts as such, but against the experts they disagree with. Okay, so this was, of course, done in the context of the Brexit debate, where this was a highly politicized environment, and there were experts on both sides saying the future holds this, and the other side is wrong. So I think this is different slightly to the same observation applies. There's an appeal to democratic empowerment of the masses and decisions by people being taken seriously despite being non-experts, right? However, this is a highly politicized situation where we don't know what the future holds. And so it's a different situation to what Rorschach described with technical experts making the system ticking over.
Sorry, who's the guy on the left?
Michael Gove.
Okay.
So he was a conservative, he still is a conservative politician. He was a cabinet minister, but he lost his position after Brexit, after the reshuffle. But he, so he famously came out with that statement. Now there is a much praised book recently published by Tom Nicholls in defense of expertise, which I think is a very mixed bag of cherry-picked anecdotes, certainly not a scholarly book, and says we have come now to a situation where there is a positive hostility to such knowledge. So he wants to defend the notion of expertise and makes fun of all sort of fake stories that you find on websites like Vox and other things, so with false information. But there are also chapters that are slightly better. I think this is not the way to address this. So I think it's, if you just go out and say, okay, we need to think again, and the criticism of expertise was wrong. We need expertise to defend a political project. Ultimately, I think this is what it is. This will backfire. So, what are we going to make of this? I still stick to the guns of a STS person and sociologist, that facts are socially constructed, expertise, of course, the same. That's why we are getting uncomfortable if this is used by the wrong people, so to speak, by political opponents, and justified with similar slogans. So people saying, I make the facts, of course, is a very banal statement that you could express in a very different way, but if people say that, that seems to be outrageous. But this is what politicians do all the time. They are not interested in best evidence, they are interested in maintaining power, and therefore they will mobilize, for example, public resentment. And I would say this is a process of elite competition. This has nothing to do with a fundamental opposition to expertise in modern societies. So when people say voters are now so stupid that they don't know what policies to follow because they don't make rational choices, they vote with their, according to sympathy or charisma or whatever. I think this has always been the case in politics. So I don't see there any recent change going on in recent times. And so this is John Gray writing last week in The Guardian about this very fact that facts have been irrelevant in politics for a while. Why are liberals so shocked by fake promises? So this was a book review of Evan Davis, who is a news night reporter for the BBC, and another book on this very topic of expertise. So we should, if we contextualize expertise in the field of politics, I think these are obvious things to say. Now, okay, concluding there, this is a sort of conceptual review. I won't go through that. The 60s, with Rojak's criticism of the headquarters and the technical experts there, the Technocracy. The 90s, STS and sociology critique, criticizing the public, criticizing experts for patronizing the public, and the current populist critique, making some use of the previous repertoire through the appeal to democracy. But it is a different political context, and we have highly politicized environments to deal with. So, final slide. So what is the rightful place of expertise? So I would say where we have technical specialists that are working on clearly defined problems, that's a rightful place where we don't have need for public debate, because we can trust them. These people have the experience and the education and the skills to do that. It becomes problematic when we have uncertainty coming in. We are not dealing with well-defined problems. We have room for decision making, and we don't know what the right decision is because we don't know the future. We don't know the side effects of our intervention. So if you think, clean water directives versus climate change, where clean water would be the tame problem and climate change the wicked problem, it is clear that what follows in terms of expertise in contemporary society, that we should have public debates about climate change, but probably not about clean water. So I think I'll leave it there.
Okay, any questions?
Just a comment, really, that Rainer presented himself several times during the talk as representing the STS position. And he wasn't representing the STS position. There have been quite different positions present in STS is 2002, and there are books published in addition to Tom Gove's book, which is a position that come out of STS.
Yes, I'm not representing the whole STS community. Don't worry.
But from a sociological point of view, I have always been fascinated by the fact that parts of the scientific community make shifting variable alliances with parts of society. For instance, think of the environmental movements. In the beginning, they were extremely wary of the official science because they thought that official science was too specialized, too narrow, unable to have an holistic approach to nature. Now with the IPCC, environmental movements are strictly allied with official science. Now, this, in my view, has little to do with the post-truth philosophies like postmodernism. It's more interesting from a sociological viewpoint because it seems to me that this does not lead us to accept a democratization of science idea. It's more connected with a theory of elites, like Pareto's elites. I mean, there are different elites competing, and these elites are supported by science, part of science, and part of society. And this has nothing to do with the idea of democratization of science. It's just the opposite. I mean, Pareto was not certainly democratic. I mean, what do you think about this?
Well, I wasn't talking about the democratization of science.
Yeah, but we mentioned democratization of science with one of your...
Well, this is a political argument about what problems are there in society and what role would expertise play or scientific expertise in solving those, right? So there is still an argument to be made. If you politicize these issues, including going to a vote, that's the critical issue, what comes up in that run-up to such an election, right? So, but I agree with you, green groups have become, very sympathetic to specific bodies of scientific work, especially around climate change. Not in other cases like genetically modified food. So there seems to be a political agenda about how useful is scientific expertise seen in a political constellation. So Greenpeace, if they think it's a good idea to make scientific arguments about climate change, that's probably what's behind that. I think it's the wrong strategy.
Just a very short remark, because philosophers tend to think of science as a general kind, opposed to society, the rest of society. I mean, this sociological remark shows that this is not the case. I mean, things are more complex.
Yes. I think Harry would agree with that.
We have time for a few more questions.
So, one issue that was evident in the question just at Jennifer as well, so the distinction between tame and wicked problems itself is quite problematic. I mean, a lot of climate scientists would argue that climate change is a tame problem. It's just something that we do and have to deal with, while on the other side of the spectrum, the opposers would at least want to present it as a wicked problem for the further discussion. So how are you going to distinguish between tameness and wickedness?
Well, there are two possible ways of dealing with that. One is an essentialist position saying, look, this is how reality is, and we have tame and wicked problems. I didn't say anything about that because it opens all sorts of further discussions, as you can imagine. The other one is to say, how have these problems been constructed in the discourse we see? And I think it has been constructed, climate change has been constructed as a tame problem with a unique solution. But if you look at it, what it is, so I had many debates after that article came out with climate scientists and other people, as you can imagine. So my argument is there are very many metrics. So how would we know if we have solved the problem of climate change? What would the metric be? And there are, of course, all sorts of metrics, gigatons of carbon, actual degrees of warming, concentrations in the atmosphere, ocean heat, energy in the oceans, and so on. So there are different metrics that probably lead to different solutions at different points in time, which means there is no unique solution. It's an ongoing process, and the criteria for success are shifting constantly. It's exactly the same problem we had in social policy, unemployment, economic growth, consequences of Brexit. These are things that will unfold in the future. We don't know what the optimal point is in this historical situation. We can't say once we have this, we have solved it. So we have very general guidelines from climate scientists like, well, it started with the UN Convention saying we need to avoid dangerous global warming. And then this was refined into a 2 degrees target, right? Or limit, rather.
I'd like to ask a question, if it's okay. So I was just wondering, when you put things up as wicked problems where expertise isn't really of any use, and I was just thinking, would it be possible to have expertise in wicked problems themselves? I mean, you might even think that maybe philosophers are quite good at least clarifying wicked problems and helping people along with solving them. Providing conceptual clarity and understanding how risk works and that kind of thing.
Yes. No, I'm not saying experts are useless here. It's technical specialists that try to argue that they know how it has to be solved, but in fact they are not. So experts meaning providing guidance for action, reflecting on the possibilities of action and so on. This is part of a public discourse. So there would be philosophical expertise if people request it. So if you enter into a social relation where people say, we actually want some philosophical guidance on that, then you would become an expert on that issue, right? And you would say there are reasons to adopting a strategy of doing this or that because of morality or utility or whatever fundamental values you want to bring to bear.
Yeah. Okay, so 2 questions.
So,
I think we only have time for maybe one. I'm sorry, I just...
Just a quick comment. Just on that particular slide, the rightful place of expertise, and you go about this solely on technical things. So wouldn't it be better to sort of rephrase it the rightful place of technical expertise, rather than expertise plural, since that you sort of narrowed on technical specialists only having their role in tame issues. So it's just sort of like, it's rather than your initial question of the rightful place of expertise plural, you seem to be just focused answering the rightful place of one particular expertise.
I think you are right, but this is the conclusion of a sort of meandering process going through different role descriptions and definitions. So you wouldn't be able to understand it if this wasn't done before, I guess, because the definition of expert is presupposing a specific view on their role in society.
Okay, so let's thank Rainer. The next speaker is Christian Kost, who's over there. And he'll be speaking to us about experts as responsible achievers. Yes.
Government presentation.